I had just turned 19 when I received that phone call that would change my life forever. "Mrs. Roxanne, we're just confirming that your husband died 3 years ago in a highway accident." And there he was, lying next to me, breathing, looking at me with eyes wide with terror. Hello, my dear viewers. I'm Roxanne Whitaker Montgomery. I'm 83 years old, and today I'm going to share a story I've kept inside me for a very long time. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel, The Grandma's Diary, which has been bringing beautiful stories from people like me who have lived long lives and have something to teach. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my words are reaching so many different places. I was born in 1942 in a small town called Silver Creek in rural Vermont. It was a different time, you know? We didn't have television at home. The radio was our greatest entertainment. And good girls like me had an almost certain destiny. Marry young, have children, take care of the house. Not that this was bad. It was the dream of many of us. And it was my dream too, for a time. My mother, Mrs. Eleanor, was a seamstress who made the most beautiful dresses in the region. My father, Mr. Walter, worked at the only bank in town. We were a simple family, but respected. I studied until I completed what they called junior high back then, and afterward started helping my mother with her sewing. I learned to embroider, to crochet, all those accomplishments that a proper young lady was supposed to know. Our town was so small that we knew practically everyone, so when a new man appeared, he became the talk of every household. And that's how it was with Theodore. He arrived on a Sunday in March of 1961, parked a gleaming blue car in the town square, and that very same day he was at the 6 o'clock service. Tall, with well-combed black hair, an impeccable suit, and a smile that, oh my, that smile moved something in me the first time I saw it. Theodore introduced himself as a seller of fine fabrics, bringing samples of silks and cashmeres from New York, Chicago, and even from distant countries like Italy and France. The ladies in town were enchanted, my mother included. And since he needed someone who understood fabrics to help him arrange his samples, I ended up being recommended. During those afternoons, we spent together organizing fabric swatches. He told me stories of his travels, of the big cities he'd seen, of the elegant hotels where he stayed. For a girl who had never left that small town, each word was like a window opening to a new world, bright and full of possibilities. It wasn't long before we started courting. My parents, initially suspicious of this outsider, were won over by his polite manners, by the small presents he brought, by how he spoke of the future with such certainty. "A man of vision," my father would say. And when, 3 months after we met, Theodore asked for my hand in marriage, there was no one who opposed it. We married in a simple but beautiful ceremony. My mother made my dress over countless nights, hand-sewing each pearl. Theodore rented a small house near the square, cozy though modest, and there we began our life together. I was certain it would be forever, just like in the movies we watched at the town's only theater. In the first months, everything was exactly as I had dreamed. Theodore was affectionate, attentive, bringing me flowers for no special reason. At night, sitting on the porch, he would tell me about the places we would visit together one day. Paris, Rome, New York. I believed every word because I wanted to believe. Because I loved him with that first love, which is so pure, so blind. It was around our 6th month of marriage that Theodore's trips started becoming more frequent and longer. "The business is growing, darling," he explained. "I'm expanding to other regions." And I, of course, supported him. What wife wouldn't be proud of her husband's success? At first, he was gone 3 or 4 days, then an entire week. Over time, his absences lasted 15 days, sometimes a month. When he returned, he always brought some gift, a silk scarf, French perfume, imported chocolates, and stories, many stories about difficult clients, luxurious hotels, business dinners. I missed him, naturally. The nights were long and quiet without his presence, but I consoled myself by tending to our home, cooking his favorite meals for when he returned, embroidering tablecloths and sheets for our home, and dreaming of the day when we would have children running through those rooms. As time passed, something began to change. I can't say exactly when I noticed the first inconsistencies. Perhaps when I mentioned the name of a client he had spoken of months before, and Theodore seemed not to remember. Or when I found a hotel receipt from Boston, dated when he said he was in Philadelphia. Small details that alone meant nothing, but together began to form a pattern. I clearly remember the first time doubt truly settled in my heart. It was when Theodore returned from a 3-week trip, and, as I unpacked his suitcase, I found a woman's handkerchief with a perfume that wasn't mine. When I asked, he laughed and said it probably belonged to the hotel maid who must have dropped it while tidying his things. I believed him, or pretended to believe, because in that era, in 1962, a wife didn't question her husband. A woman didn't raise suspicions without concrete proof, and more than anything, I didn't want to see the truth that was beginning to take shape before my eyes. The trips continued, becoming longer each time. There was a period when Theodore was gone for almost 2 months. When I called some of the contacts he had left me, no one could tell me his exact whereabouts. He must be visiting other clients, they would say, and I swallowed the knot in my throat, along with my growing doubts. It was during this time that I began to notice other details. How Theodore avoided talking about his family, how he never took me on his trips, even when I insisted I could help him with clients. How, sometimes, he received phone calls late at night and went out to the yard to answer them, returning with a worried expression. One afternoon, while cleaning the lining of one of his old jackets, I found an ID card. The man in the photo was Theodore, no doubt, but the name was different: Thomas Whitaker. I kept that to myself, not mentioning it. I began paying more attention, looking for more clues. During one of his long absences, I decided it was time to search more thoroughly. I went through every corner of our house while he was away. That's how I found, hidden in the lining of an old suitcase, a box with documents. There were other IDs with different names, but always with his photo. Birth certificates. A death certificate in the name of Thomas Whitaker, dated 3 years before we met. And worst of all, photographs. Photographs of Theodore, or whoever he was, with other women. In some, there were children. My world collapsed in that moment. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, surrounded by those proofs of betrayal, and cried until I had no more tears. But then, something inside me changed. A strength I didn't know I possessed began to grow. I would not be just another victim. I needed to understand exactly who I was married to and what was happening. Carefully, I copied addresses I found in the documents. I wrote down names, dates, and then I put everything back exactly as it was. When Theodore returned a week later, I greeted him with the same smile as always. I served his favorite meal, listened to his stories with feigned interest. On the outside, I was the same devoted Roxanne. Inside, something had died, and something new, harder, more determined had been born. During the 3 years we had been married, I had never left our little town alone. But now, I had a purpose. I waited for Theodore to leave for another of his business trips, and for the first time, I packed my own bags. I told my mother I was going to visit a distant cousin, and I caught the bus to Pittsburgh, the first of the addresses I had found. What I discovered on that journey changed my life forever. And it confirms that shocking phrase I began my story with. The man I called husband, who slept beside me, had officially died 3 years earlier in an accident that never happened. But that, my dears, is for the next chapter of my story. If you want to know what I discovered in Pittsburgh and how I unmasked the man I thought was my husband, don't forget to keep watching. And again, please like, subscribe to The Grandma's Diary, and share this with someone who needs to hear a story of overcoming like mine. Thank you for listening to me this far. Part 2. You can't imagine what I felt when I stepped off that bus in Pittsburgh. It was 1964. I had just turned 22. And I had never been in a big city before. The buildings, the noise, so many people rushing about. Everything frightened me. But what frightened me even more was what I might discover about the man I called my husband. I took with me only the address I had written down and a photograph of Theodore. The address led me to a modest neighborhood where I found a small house with flowers in the garden. My heart was beating so hard I thought I might faint when I knocked on the door. A woman opened it. She must have been about 30, with a child clinging to her skirt. When I asked for Thomas Whitaker, I saw her face turn pale. "Who are you?" she asked with a trembling voice. I didn't know what to answer. I couldn't simply say, "I'm his wife," so I lied. I said I was a distant cousin, trying to locate relatives for a family matter. She reluctantly invited me in. The house was simple but cozy, with photographs on the walls. And there he was, my Theodore, smiling in several picture frames, with that woman, with 2 children. The name in the photos, Thomas and family. I needed all my strength not to show my shock. The woman introduced herself as Madeline, widow of Thomas Whitaker. She told me, barely holding back tears, that her husband had died in a car accident on the highway 3 years before. "It was horrible," she said. "The car caught fire. They couldn't even recover the body properly." As she spoke, my eyes scanned the room and noticed something on the shelf. A small funeral urn with a plaque. Thomas Whitaker, 1935–1961. I was sitting in the living room of my own husband's widow, looking at his supposed ashes, while he, alive and well, was probably deceiving another woman somewhere in America. Madeline showed me newspaper clippings about the accident, the death certificate, talked about the life insurance she had received, and how it had helped raise the children. "It wasn't much, but it helped us start over," she said. With each word, I understood more of the scheme and felt my heart sink. Before leaving, I asked to use the bathroom. In the hallway, I saw a half-open door. It looked like some kind of office. Taking a risk, I quickly entered and searched through the drawers. I found insurance papers, old correspondence, and something that made my blood run cold. A photo of Thomas with another woman, who was neither me nor Madeline, with a note on the back. Charleston, 1962. That was the same year he married me. I left Madeline's house with my head spinning. I checked into an inexpensive motel and spent the entire night awake trying to put together the pieces of that macabre puzzle. The next day, I used almost all my savings to hire a private detective, Mr. Jenkins, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who didn't seem surprised by my story. "Ma'am, unfortunately, this is more common than you might think," he told me. "These con men take advantage of lonely women, forge documents, even fake their own deaths to pull off scams." For a week, Mr. Jenkins investigated the other addresses I had brought. We discovered 3 more women in different cities, Charleston, Denver, and Atlanta, all believing they were married to different versions of the same man: Theodore, the fabric salesman; Timothy, the commercial representative; Taylor, the coffee merchant. The scheme was always the same. He presented himself as a businessman, won the trust of the woman and her family, married her, and, over time, began to take increasingly long business trips. In some cases, he opened joint accounts that he gradually emptied. In others, like Madeline's case, he went so far as to fake his own death to collect insurance. "Your case is different," Mr. Jenkins explained. "He didn't fake his death for you, nor does he seem to have stolen your money. Perhaps you were, how can I put this? A safe harbor, a place to rest between one con and another." That phrase wounded me like a knife. I hadn't even been important enough to be completely deceived. I was just a comfortable break in that man's criminal life. I returned to my town with a heavy heart and a folder full of evidence. Photographs, testimonies, copies of documents, all documenting the double life, actually quintuple life, of the man I called my husband. Now I knew that his real name was Thomas, that he had started his career as a con man in Pennsylvania, and that I was just one of his many victims. What to do with that information? At that time, a separated woman was viewed with suspicion and pity. Publicly exposing the fraud would mean exposing my own naivety, becoming the subject of gossip and pity in the small town where everyone knew each other. Moreover, there were the other women, some with small children. Reporting him would mean destroying other families, even if they were based on lies. I decided to wait. I kept the evidence in a safe place and continued my life as if I knew nothing. When Theodore, or rather Thomas, returned from his trip, I received him normally. I served his favorite food, listened to his made-up stories, slept beside him feeling a mix of disgust and sadness. For weeks I formulated my plan. I wouldn't be impulsive. I needed to secure my future, think about every detail. That's when I had an idea. I secretly communicated with Mr. Jenkins, who helped me contact one of the other wives, Dolores from Charleston, who had discovered the truth a few months before me. Together, we devised a strategy. On a June night in 1964, everything was ready. Thomas had returned from a business trip that same day, exhausted. As we ate dinner, I commented casually, "Darling, isn't it strange? Today a woman came to Mother's shop asking about you. She said she knew you from Pittsburgh." I saw his face pale slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Must be a mistake, my dear. I've never lived in Pittsburgh." That's what I told her. But she insisted so strongly that she knew a Thomas Whitaker who looked just like you. He almost dropped his fork. "What nonsense! Must be some crazy woman." I smiled calmly and changed the subject. But I had planted the seed of fear exactly as planned. That night, we went to bed early. He seemed restless, turning in bed several times. Around 11 o'clock, the phone rang. I answered with my heart racing, knowing exactly what was coming. On the other end of the line, Dolores, following our planned script, said in a loud and clear voice, "Ma'am, we're just confirming that your husband Thomas Whitaker died 3 years ago in a highway accident near Pittsburgh." I felt Thomas sit up abruptly in bed beside me. I replied calmly, "What did you say? My husband is dead? But he's right here beside me." The expression of panic on his face when I turned to look at him is something I'll never forget. His eyes were wide open, his mouth agape, all the blood had drained from his face. I hung up the phone slowly, without taking my eyes off his. "Is there a problem, Theodore? Or should I call you Thomas? Or do you prefer Timothy? Taylor, perhaps?" He tried to get up, but I had anticipated this. "Don't worry," I said, surprisingly calm. "The bags you keep in the basement with your fake documents and hidden money? They're not there anymore. And all the exits of the house are being watched by people who know exactly who you are." It was a bluff, of course. There was no one watching the house, but he had no way of knowing that. I saw desperation grow in his eyes as he calculated his chances. "Roxanne, I can explain," he began, using that soft tone that had deceived me so many times. "It's not what you're thinking." "Isn't it?" I asked, opening the nightstand drawer and taking out some of the photographs I had collected. "Isn't this you with Madeline and your 2 children in Pittsburgh? Or with Dolores in Charleston? Or perhaps you'd like to explain how you managed to die in 1961 and still be here, breathing in front of me?" He looked at the photographs, then at me, and something changed in his face. The mask of charm and confidence fell away completely, revealing what was beneath, a cornered, calculating, dangerous man. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice different, colder, more true. "I want you to listen very carefully," I replied, surprising myself with my firmness. "I have copies of all your fake documents, testimonies from your other wives, evidence of every scam you've pulled in recent years. If anything happens to me, all of this goes straight to the police." He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I won't report you," I continued. "Not for your sake, but because I don't want other innocent women and children to suffer the public humiliation. But I have my conditions." It was there that night that I took control of my life for the first time. I demanded that he finance my education. I wanted to study business administration, something unusual for women at that time. I also demanded a sum to open my own business, ironically, a fine fabric store, taking advantage of the knowledge I had acquired from him. And after that, I want you to disappear from my life forever. No official divorce. I know our marriage isn't legal anyway, since you're still officially married to Madeline. Just go away and never come back." He agreed to everything. What else could he do? That very night, he wrote a check for a considerable amount, money that, I later discovered, came from his scams. The next morning before dawn, he left. He left behind only a note. "You're smarter and stronger than all the others. Maybe that's why I really did care for you." When my parents and the neighbors asked about Theodore's sudden disappearance, I told the story I had prepared. He had received an irresistible offer to work abroad and had left in a hurry. Over time, he would stop responding to my letters, and I would become another widow with a living husband, like so many others in that era. But I would not be a victim. I wouldn't cry for a man who never existed. The pain of betrayal was real. The love I felt was also real. But now I had something more important, my own life to rebuild. And that's exactly what I began to do the very next day. I enrolled in preparatory courses for college entrance exams, facing looks of astonishment from men and women who couldn't understand why a married woman wanted to study. I rented a small commercial space and began planning my fine fabric store, the same ones that Thomas sold in his imaginary travels. That phone call on that dark night in June was the end of a life based on lies, but it was also the beginning of my true story. A story that, I promise, becomes even more surprising from here on. But that, my dears, I'll tell in the next chapter. If you're enjoying my story of overcoming, please leave your like and share with someone you think needs to hear this. Sometimes, it's from the most painful situations that our greatest strength is born. Thank you for continuing with me on this journey. Part 3. Picking up my story, my dear viewers. That year of 1964 marked the beginning of a new Roxanne. A woman born from the ashes of a marriage based on lies. Many ask me how I found the strength to move forward after such disappointment. The truth? I simply had no choice. Life doesn't stop to console us. The first months were the hardest. I woke up every morning with that strange feeling in my chest, an inexplicable emptiness. It wasn't longing for Thomas. It was longing for the innocent Roxanne I had been, for the woman who believed in romantic love, in happy endings, in eternal promises. That Roxanne had died along with Thomas's lies, and I was still mourning her. I clearly remember the day I took the exam to enter college. It was March 1965, I was 23, and I sat in a room full of young people, 18 or 19 years old. The only mature face besides mine was that of a gentleman almost 50 years old, who I later discovered was a retired judge fulfilling an old dream. When the proctor distributed the tests, a girl next to me whispered, "Ma'am, aren't you in the wrong room? This is college entrance, not a sewing class." I took a deep breath, looked her in the eyes, and replied quietly, "I'm exactly where I should be." And I was. I finished that test with hands aching from writing so much and the certainty that for the first time I was charting my own path. When the results came out, my name was among those accepted for the business administration program. Only 3 women had passed that year out of a total of 40 spots. My father, who had initially resisted the idea of seeing me studying men's things, was so proud that he framed the newspaper with the list of approved candidates. My mother, always more practical, just said, "It's good that you have a degree, daughter, now that your husband has left you." Because that was the official version circulating in town. The fabric seller had abandoned poor Roxanne for an opportunity abroad. Some people looked at me with pity, others with that air of, I knew it wouldn't work out. Very few, like my friend Helen, offered genuine support. It was she, in fact, who helped me find a place to live closer to the college. I moved into a tiny apartment, but it was mine alone. For the first time in my life, I wasn't answering to father, mother, or husband. I decorated those walls with the colors I wanted, arranged the furniture the way I liked, and began to discover who Roxanne was when she wasn't being someone's daughter or wife. College was a completely new world. The professors, mostly older men, looked at the female students with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. One of them, right in the first class, even said, "Ladies, you are aware that this course trains professionals for the workforce, not for organizing charity teas, correct?" That, which should have intimidated me, only increased my determination. I studied twice as hard, spent nights bent over books on accounting, statistics, economics. I tortured my friends asking them to test me before exams. And gradually, the looks of skepticism gave way to reluctant respect, then to genuine admiration. Parallel to my studies, I began setting up my store. I used the money Thomas had left me, a considerable sum, the fruit of his scams, which I decided to transform into something honest and mine. I rented a small space, painted the walls myself, and named the business Golden Threads, because I believed that even from the darkest experiences, we can extract golden threads of learning. At first, I sold only basic fabrics and notions. But I soon realized there was an untapped niche: fine fabrics for formal and wedding attire. Ironically, the knowledge I gained by observing Thomas, or whoever he was, served me at this moment. I knew how to recognize quality, understand the origin of materials, negotiate with suppliers. I remember the day I closed my first big deal. It was September 1965, and the mayor's daughter was getting married. The bride's mother, Mrs. Evelyn, came into my shop by chance, looking for lace for the dress. I showed her a piece of Italian silk that had just arrived. I had invested almost all my savings in it. When Mrs. Evelyn touched the fabric, her eyes lit up. "Where did you get this, girl? I couldn't find anything like it, even in New York." "I have my contacts, Mrs. Evelyn," I replied, feeling a bitter taste of irony. The contacts were, in fact, a legitimate vendor I had met through my investigations about Thomas. Mrs. Evelyn not only bought the entire piece of silk, but hired me to supply all the fabrics and notions for the wedding, including for the dresses of the 5 bridesmaids. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I cried. Not from sadness, but from a strange mixture of relief and pride. It was really happening. I was reinventing myself. The mayor's daughter's wedding was a milestone. The women of high society, impressed with the quality of the materials, began frequenting my store. Soon I needed to hire an assistant, then another. Meanwhile, I continued studying, often going straight from the store to evening classes, exhausted but determined. It was around 1967 that things really began to change. I was in my 3rd year of college, my grades were exemplary, and the store was prospering to the point that I was already thinking about expanding. That's when I met Mrs. Augusta, an elegant lady of almost 70, widow of an industrialist. She came into my store looking for fabrics to renovate the decor of her mansion. As we showed her the options, Mrs. Augusta began asking questions about me, about how a young woman managed a business alone, about my studies. I answered honestly, omitting only the sordid details about Thomas. I spoke of my passion for commerce, of how I believed women could and should seek financial independence. "You know, my dear," said Mrs. Augusta, "my husband left me several commercial properties downtown. I have a space 3 times larger than this, on the main avenue, empty for months. Would it interest you?" I swallowed hard. That space on the main avenue was any merchant's dream, but it would be completely beyond my financial reach. "I'm afraid the rent for a place like that is beyond my current possibilities, Mrs. Augusta." She smiled, with that air of knowing more than she was saying. "Perhaps we can come to a different arrangement. Come have tea with me tomorrow and we'll talk." The next day, nervous as a schoolgirl, I knocked on the door of Mrs. Augusta's mansion. In her luxurious winter garden, among fine porcelain cups and buttery cookies, she made me a proposal that would change my life. She would be my partner in the expansion of the store. She would contribute the space and capital. I would provide the knowledge and management. We would split the profits. "But why?" I asked, genuinely confused. "You barely know me." "When my Augustus died," she explained, "the businessmen in this town thought they could steamroll over me, that a widow wouldn't understand business. I proved them wrong. But it was a lonely battle. I want to help women like you, who have grit, intelligence, determination. Besides, she added with a mischievous smile, I have a good eye for profitable businesses. Thus was born the new Golden Threads, inaugurated in January 1968 with a party that stirred up the entire town. The space was stunning, with large display windows, elegant fitting rooms, an exclusive section for brides. Besides fabrics, we began selling imported ready-made pieces, accessories, decor items. We hired more employees, all women, many in vulnerable situations such as single mothers and widows without income. That same year, I graduated from college as the top student in my class. At the graduation ceremony, I looked at the audience and saw my parents, proud, alongside Mrs. Augusta. There was no Thomas there, nor would he be missed. I had built something much bigger than a marriage. I had built my own life on my own terms. Over time, the story of the husband who went abroad was forgotten, replaced by the image of the successful businesswoman. I was no longer the poor thing who was abandoned, but the businesswoman who transformed fashion in the town. In 1970, we expanded to a second store in another town. In 1972, we launched our own line of fabrics, produced by national textile mills following our exclusive patterns. With each step, the memory of Thomas became more distant, like a nightmare that gradually loses strength with the dawn. But there was one thing I couldn't forget: the other women. Madeline, with her small children, living on the pension of her dead husband. Dolores, who had helped me with the revealing phone call. And how many others would there be that I didn't know about? Women deceived, betrayed, abandoned by men like Thomas. One night in 1973, alone in the office after closing the store, I had an idea. We were already a prosperous company, with resources, influence. Why not use this to help other women who, like me in the past, needed to start over from zero? The next morning, I presented the idea to Mrs. Augusta. Create a foundation linked to our company that would offer professional training, financial guidance, and even small loans to women in vulnerable situations, especially those abandoned or betrayed by their spouses. Mrs. Augusta listened to everything attentively, and at the end had tears in her eyes. My dear, she said, this is exactly what I've always dreamed of doing, but never knew how to start. You haven't just overcome your past, you're transforming it into light for others. In October 1973, we inaugurated the Dawn Foundation, a name chosen to symbolize a new dawn in the lives of those women. We started small, with sewing classes and basic administration, but soon we were offering technical courses, guidance for small businesses, even a daycare so that mothers could study peacefully. Some people in town turned up their noses, of course. She's encouraging women to abandon their homes, some said. This will end marriages, others complained. But for every criticism, there were 10 success stories, women who, like me, discovered their inner strength and capacity for reinvention. I especially remember Marianne, a young woman of 24 who came to the foundation in 1974 with a 3-month-old baby in her arms and marks of violence still visible on her face. Her husband, an alcoholic, had beaten her for the last time before she finally fled. With no education, no profession, no family support, she saw no way out. How will I support my child alone? Maybe I should go back. He promises he'll change, she said, with that look I knew well, the look of someone who has grown accustomed to having no choices. You are not alone, I replied, holding her hands. And your story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just beginning. Today, so many years later, Marianne is the manager of one of our stores, and her daughter, that baby she carried in her arms, graduated in law. There are hundreds of stories like this, hundreds of lives transformed, in a cascade effect that began on that terrible night when I received a phone call saying my husband was dead, while he slept by my side. The pain of betrayal, the humiliation, the fear of the future, all of this was real. But equally real was the strength I discovered, the ability not only to survive, but to thrive and help others do the same. If I could go back in time, I wouldn't change anything. Every tear shed was a seed for what would come after. And what came after, my dears, included a surprise that even in my wildest dreams I couldn't have imagined. A surprise that arrived by mail almost 20 years later, when I had almost forgotten the real name of the man I once called husband. Part 4. The 70s and 80s were a time of steady growth, both for the business and for me personally. Our Golden Threads chain expanded to 5 stores in different cities, and the Dawn Foundation had already helped more than 1,000 women restart their lives. In 1982, I lost my great friend and mentor, Mrs. Augusta, who passed away at 85, leaving me as the main manager of everything we had built together. It was a hard blow, but she had taught me well. I continued our work with the same determination. I had just turned 40 when I began receiving invitations to give lectures at universities and conferences about female entrepreneurship. Just imagine. I, who once was that shy, small-town girl, was now on stages, telling my story, or at least the version of it that could be shared publicly. In 1985, I was invited to participate in a television program about successful women in business. It was a new show, hosted by a young journalist who asked direct questions without beating around the bush. "Roxanne, we know you started your empire after being abandoned by your husband. How did you transform that pain into strength?" she asked, live, for the whole country. I took a deep breath before answering. Pain teaches us a lot if we're willing to learn. My greatest lesson was realizing that our happiness cannot depend on another person. When my marriage ended, I discovered I had 2 options: sink into bitterness or use that experience as impetus for something greater. I chose the second option. What I didn't tell, of course, was about the phone call on that dark night, about the farce that had been my marriage, about how Thomas never really existed. Some truths are too heavy to be carried by others. That interview changed many things. Letters began to arrive, dozens, then hundreds of them. Women from all over America writing to share their stories, thank me for the inspiration, ask for advice. I read each letter personally and answered many by hand, even when my assistants insisted it was impossible to keep up with so much correspondence. It was like this, among piles of letters, that in September 1987, I remember the date precisely, I found a different envelope. No return address, superior quality paper. My name written in handwriting that even after so many years, I immediately recognized. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, several pages filled with Thomas's precise, slanted handwriting. I sat down, took a deep breath, and began to read. "Roxanne, if this letter has reached your hands, it means I am no longer in this world. I left instructions for it to be sent only after my death. I don't expect your forgiveness. I know what I did is unforgivable, but I feel I owe you, at least, the complete truth. You were the only one, among all, who beat me at my own game. The only one intelligent and strong enough to unmask me and, still, find a better path than revenge. I was born Thomas Whitaker in 1935, son of a small merchant from Pittsburgh. My father was an honest man to the core who died young, leaving us in poverty. I watched my mother wither away working as a domestic servant, humiliated daily, until she succumbed to tuberculosis when I was only 15 years old. I promised myself I would never be poor or humiliated like them. I started with small scams, then evolved to more elaborate frauds. The traveling salesman scheme emerged when I realized how easy it was to gain the trust of families in small towns, where a well-dressed, well-mannered stranger was received as an exciting novelty. You ask why I chose you? At first it was calculated like all the others, but something happened that I didn't plan. I genuinely began to enjoy being with you. Your sincerity, your genuine kindness were like another world to me, a world that, deep down, I envied. The days in your town, in our small house, were the only moments when I wasn't completely acting. There was a peace there that I never found anywhere else. That's why I could never pull the final con on you, as I did with the others. I never emptied our accounts, never faked my death for you. Part of me wanted to believe we could have a real life together. After you discovered me, and I admit I was impressed with your courage and intelligence, I continued my scams for a while. But something had changed inside me. Guilt, which I had never felt before, began to eat at me. In 1975, I was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. The doctors gave me just a few years to live. I then decided to do something I never imagined. I began returning the money, anonymously of course, to Madeline, to the others. And I followed your trajectory from afar, Roxanne. I saw each of your achievements, each expansion of your business, each award. I was proud of you, as if I had any right to be. I know I must seem pathetic now, an old con man trying to clear his conscience before dying. Perhaps that's exactly it. But I want you to know that among all the lies I told in life, there was one truth. The moments with you were the closest I ever came to knowing what real love is. With this letter, I am leaving instructions for a substantial amount to be transferred to your foundation, clean money, the fruit of legitimate investments I made in recent years. Accept it not for me, but for the women you can help. If someday you can think of me without hatred, it will already be more than I deserve. Goodbye, Roxanne. Thomas. I read the letter 3-4 times, with silent tears running down my face. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but of an emotion I couldn't name, a kind of closure, perhaps. Along with the letter were documents from a Swiss bank confirming the transfer of a sum that left me breathless. It was enough money to expand the foundation across the country. That night, alone in my apartment, I looked out the window at the city I now called mine. I tried to imagine where and how Thomas had died. Alone? Repentant? Had he really changed, or was this just his last and most elaborate con? I would never know for sure. What I did know, however, was that money could change the lives of hundreds of women. After consulting lawyers and confirming the funds were legal, I accepted the donation. But with one condition: we would never use Thomas's name. Instead, we would create a new program called Project Rebirth, because in the end, that's what it was about, giving a chance for rebirth to those who needed it. 2 weeks after receiving the letter, I made an impulsive decision. I took a plane to Pittsburgh, the city where it all began. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, perhaps some kind of more concrete closure. I hired a local detective, the same type of professional who had helped me decades before. I need to find information about the recent death of a man named Thomas Whitaker, I explained, and also the current address of a woman named Madeline, who was his wife in the 60s. 3 days later, I had my answers. Thomas had indeed died, 2 months earlier, in a hospital in Boston, after years battling heart problems. He had lived modestly, under the name Theodore Sanders, in a small apartment. He left no family. The detective also discovered that Madeline still lived in Pittsburgh, now a 55-year-old woman, a retired teacher. The next day, I stood in front of her house, questioning my own sanity. What would I say? "Hello, I was also married to your dead husband?" I was about to leave when the door opened and a gray-haired woman came out to water the plants in the garden. The same garden where I had been for the first time 23 years earlier. She noticed my presence and looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. "Madeline?" My voice came out almost in a whisper. She furrowed her brow, trying to recognize me. "Yes, that's me. Do we know each other?" "Many years ago," I replied, gathering courage. "I've come to talk to you about Thomas." Her face turned pale. She invited me in with a trembling voice. In the same living room where I had been before, now remodeled but still recognizable, I told her the whole story. About how Thomas had pretended to be Theodore, about our marriage, about how I discovered the truth, about the letter I had just received. I expected anger, perhaps hostility, but what I saw was profound exhaustion. "So it was true," she said after I finished. I always suspected he had faked his own death. The insurance investigators did too, but they could never prove it. Madeline then told me her own version. How she had met Thomas when they were young, how he had always been charming but unstable, disappearing for long periods. How, after his supposed accident, she had received a modest life insurance that barely covered the debts he had left. How she had raised the children alone, with difficulty. "And you know what's strangest," she said, serving us tea. "About 10 years ago, I started receiving anonymous deposits. Small amounts at first, then larger. I suspected it was him, trying to make amends somehow." We sat in silence for a moment, two women united by a man who had deceived them both, and who, perhaps in the end, had tried to make peace with his past in the only way he knew. "Your children," I began hesitantly. "Do they know?" "The oldest one suspects. The youngest was very small when it happened, barely remembers his father. I preferred to leave it that way." She took a sip of tea. "And you? Do you have a family?" I smiled. "In a way. I have my businesses, my foundation, hundreds of women who have passed through our doors. It's a different kind of family, but it's mine." We talked for hours, sharing stories not just of Thomas, but of our lives, of how each of us, in our own way, had overcome that betrayal. When I said goodbye, Madeline unexpectedly embraced me. "He didn't deserve either of us," she whispered. "No," I replied. "But perhaps we deserved the strength we found after him." I returned home with a strange sense of peace. The circle was closed. Thomas, the man who had broken my heart and transformed my life, was now just a memory, no longer a ghost haunting my thoughts. The money he had left would be used for a greater good, helping women do the same that Madeline and I had done, rebuild life on our own terms. In the following years, Project Rebirth expanded to 5 states. Stories of transformation multiplied. When, in 1995, the press discovered the generous anonymous donation that had financed this expansion, I invented a story about a benefactor who wished to remain unknown. After all, certain truths are like seeds. They need suitable soil to germinate. And the truth about Thomas, about me, about our strange and tortuous journey, was perhaps too complex to be shared at that moment. But today, decades later, I feel I can finally tell this story completely. Not to arouse pity or admiration, but to show that our deepest wounds sometimes become our greatest sources of strength. That phone call on the dark night, "Your husband died 3 years ago," was not the end of my story. It was just the first chapter of a life that I would write myself, page by page, with my own hands. But there's still one last chapter to tell, the legacy I built and what happened in the last decades, up to the present day. How I transformed that frightening phone call into a full life, with purpose, until reaching my 83 years with a light heart, despite the scars. And that, my dears, I will share in our last meeting. Part 5. And so we come to the final chapter of my story, my dear viewers. The 90s brought winds of change to America and to me as well. By 1994, our stores already totaled 12 units spread across the country. The Dawn Foundation, with the boost from Project Rebirth, had become a nationally respected organization, receiving awards and international recognition. But I confess that, despite all external success, I still carried a weight with me. Not exactly from Thomas, but from what that experience had done to me. I realized that, amid my determination to prove my worth and help other women, I had built walls around myself. I never allowed myself a true relationship after that fraudulent marriage. I dedicated myself entirely to work, to social causes, but my personal life was an emotional desert. It was my niece Claire who first pointed this out. Claire, my younger sister's daughter, had begun working with me in 1992, freshly graduated in business administration. One night after a long day of work, we were reviewing reports in my office when she suddenly put the papers aside. "Aunt Roxy," she said, using the childhood nickname few still used. Have you ever thought about slowing down, taking a real vacation? Maybe, I don't know, allowing someone to get close? I looked up, surprised. What are you talking about, Claire? I'm perfectly happy with my life. Are you really? She gently insisted. You've built an empire to help women liberate themselves, but sometimes I wonder if you yourself have completely broken free. Those words hit me like lightning. Claire was right. In my quest to overcome the past, I had become a prisoner of it in another way. I didn't trust, didn't open up, didn't take risks. It was safe, but was it really living? I decided that, at 53, maybe it was time to try something new, to loosen the reins, at least a little. The next day, to everyone's shock at the company, I announced I would take a month's vacation, something I hadn't done in decades, and that I would travel alone through Europe. I left in March 1995 with just one small suitcase, no fixed itinerary. I started in London, city of some of my ancestors. Then I continued to Madrid, Paris, Rome, Vienna. In each city, I avoided the traditional tourist circuits. Instead, I lost myself in ancient alleys, sat in cafes, observing local life, visited street markets. It was in Florence, in the third week of that transformative journey, that I met Antonio. He was the owner of a small vineyard on the outskirts of the city and was on the same tour as me to visit lesser-known museums. We talked casually during the tour, he in his heavily accented English, me trying to remember the little Italian I had studied before the trip. "Are you here alone, madam?" he asked, as we admired a particularly beautiful fresco. "Yes, traveling alone for the first time," I replied. "And you?" "I've been a widower for 5 years," he explained. "My Sophia would want me to keep living, so here I am, trying." There was a disarming sincerity in that gray-haired man with a face marked by the Tuscan vineyard sun. At the end of the tour, he invited me to dinner. I accepted, to my own surprise. During dinner, I told him fragments of my story, not everything, certainly, but enough for him to understand that I, too, carried scars. "La vita è strana," he said, raising his wine glass. "Life is strange. Sometimes it wounds us deeply, but these wounds create space for something new to grow." In the following days, Antonio showed me his Florence, not the one from postcards, but the one known by locals. He took me to his vineyard, where I met his family, 2 adult children, daughters-in-law, 5 noisy grandchildren who ran among the vines. They welcomed me with warm Italian hospitality as if we were old friends. On the eve of my return to America, Antonio and I walked along the banks of the Arno River. "Come back to visit us, Roxanne," he said simply. "There's always a bottle of wine waiting for you at my table." I returned to America renewed, with a different perspective. No, it wasn't a movie romance. Antonio and I were too mature for that. It was something equally valuable. A sincere friendship, a reminder that genuine human connections were still possible for me. In the following years, I traveled to Tuscany regularly. Antonio and I maintained that special friendship until his death in 2005. We never lived together, never married, but we shared many precious moments, deep conversations, dinners under the Tuscan stars. He taught me about wines and olive trees. I told him about the Foundation's projects. His family became an extension of mine. To this day, I keep in touch with his children and grandchildren. It was during this period that I made another important decision, to prepare the leadership transition for the company and foundation. Claire, my niece, already demonstrated all the qualities necessary to take over the business. Slowly, I began to transfer more responsibilities to her and to a team of talented young female executives we had formed, many of them former beneficiaries of the foundation itself. In 1998, at 56, I reduced my workload to part-time, dedicating more time to personal projects and travel. I began writing a book, not about Thomas, but about the hundreds of women we had helped over the years. Rebirths, published in 2000, became an unexpected bestseller and opened doors for conferences and lectures at universities. The new century brought accelerated changes. The internet transformed our business. We opened an online store in 2003 when this was still a novelty in America. The foundation expanded its reach through online programs, reaching women in remote areas of the country. In 2008, we inaugurated our first international branch in Nairobi, Kenya, helping African women develop their own businesses. It was also during this period that I received a surprising phone call. It was Robert, Madeline, and Thomas's youngest son. "Mrs. Roxanne," he said hesitantly on the phone, "my mother passed away last month, and among her belongings we found letters from you. I'd like to meet you in person, if possible." After that first meeting with Madeline in 1987, we had maintained sporadic contact, occasional letters, phone calls during the holidays. She never revealed the complete truth to her children about their father, only that I was an old family friend. Now, at 46, Robert was seeking answers. I invited him to visit me in New York, where I now lived in a cozy apartment overlooking Central Park. When he arrived, I was struck by the resemblance. He had the same intense eyes as Thomas, the same determined chin. "My mother always said that one day she would tell me the whole truth about my father," explained Robert, sitting in my living room. "But time passed. She fell ill quickly. And now I only have questions." I looked at that man, not a victim as I once was, but still someone whose past had been built on lies, and made a decision. I told him everything. About how Thomas had faked his own death, about our marriage, about the other women, about the letter I had received decades earlier, and also about the good side, how the money left by Thomas had helped hundreds of women through the foundation. Robert listened to everything in silence, occasionally wiping away a tear. "I always suspected there was more to this story," he finally said. "Some details never made sense. Thank you for your honesty." "Your father wasn't a bad man," I told him, surprised by my own words. "He was complicated, full of contradictions. He hurt many people, but, in the end, he tried to do something right." Robert nodded. "I can't judge him. I didn't know him well enough for that. But I can choose what to do with this story, can't I? Just as you did." Before leaving, he handed me a small box. "I found this among my mother's things. I think it should be with you." Inside the box was an antique brooch, a small golden flower with a pearl in the center. I recognized it immediately. It had been my wedding gift to Madeline, bought with my meager savings during the visit I made to her in 1987. "She wore it on special occasions," explained Robert. "She said it was to remind her that even from the most painful stories, true friendships can be born." That meeting with Robert was a kind of final closure. The circle was complete. The ghosts of the past, finally, completely exorcised. In 2010, at 68, I officially retired from business management, taking only an advisory role on the foundation's board. Claire took over as CEO of the group, further modernizing operations while maintaining the essential values we had established. The following years were dedicated to personal projects. I began to paint, a hobby I had always wanted to develop. I traveled extensively, often accompanying social projects in developing countries. In 2015, at 73, I accepted an invitation to teach social entrepreneurship at a university, an invigorating experience, sharing knowledge with young people eager to make a difference in the world. Today, at 83, I look back and see not just the pain of that fraudulent marriage and that frightening phone call, but everything that came after. The stores that became a national chain, the foundation that impacted more than 10,000 women, the published books, the lectures, deep friendships like the one I had with Antonio, the borrowed children like Robert, the Italian grandnephews who affectionately call me Nonna Roxanne when I visit them in Tuscany. I realized that phone call I received so many decades ago, "Your husband died 3 years ago," was paradoxically the beginning of my true life. It was when I stopped being a character in someone else's story and began to write my own narrative. You might wonder if I have regrets. If looking back, I wish I had never met Thomas, never lived that farce, never felt that piercing pain of betrayal. The honest answer? No, I don't regret it. That experience forged me. transformed me into the woman I became. Pain is a severe teacher, but an efficient one. It teaches us about our own strength, about the human capacity to begin again, about how the deepest wounds can transform into blessings in disguise. If today I am who I am, if I've helped who I've helped, if I've built what I've built, I owe much to that terrible night when I received a phone call saying my husband was dead, while he slept by my side. Today I live at peace with my past. The scars are still there, of course. Scars don't disappear, but they no longer hurt. They are just marks of a battle won, testimonies of an extraordinary journey that began with tears and ends, now, with gratitude. And if there's a message I'd like to leave with you, who have so generously accompanied me through this narrative, it is this. No matter how dark the night you're going through now, dawn will come. Perhaps not in the way you expect or desire, but it will come. And when it does, you'll realize that the darkness didn't just pass, it taught you to see better. This was my story. Thank you for listening to me with such care. If it touched your heart in any way, please leave your like, share with someone who might need hope today, and subscribe to The Grandma's Diary for more stories like this one. After all, each of us carries a story of overcoming within us. Some already lived, others still to be lived. And always remember, we are not defined by the blows life gives us, but by the strength with which we rise after them. A big hug from this grandma who learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest pains. Until next time, my dears.